just doing a quick mic check, make sure can you guys all hear me okay? And if you can, then I will go ahead and start. Okay, I heard that myself. Alright, fantastic. Okay, so today we're going to resume our discussion which we started last week, which is on lighting. If you didn't watch last week, then that's no problem, because we're actually covering some different topics today that they build on what we discussed last week, but they're not reliant on it. So today there is two topics I want to try and cover. They are big complex topics, so I'm sure we'll come back to these at some point in the future, but I just want to give you a good overview of some of the fundamentals of. First is post-processing and how to get the best results from the post stack. And the second topic I want to discuss is light mapping and global illumination, which I think a lot of people are interested in hearing about. So I think I'll start today off on light mapping, and then I'll switch over to global illumination. Switch over to post effects after I've got into light mapping, because light mapping is probably the more important of the two topics, and one that I think that could use a little bit of help with the documentation front. So today I'm actually going to be working with a scene that was produced by someone else. The scene was actually in the asset store. Unfortunately, I think it's been depreciated by the developer of it, so you can't purchase it anymore, but it's a good little scene for testing things out. If it is in there, it's called the Savannah package, and it just contains this pack here, which I'm showing you. Right now, everything in the scene is 100% runtime lighting. That is, that nothing in this scene has got any baked lighting at all to it. Everything is coming through at runtime, and the perks of having runtime lighting over baked lighting is, first, that we can actually change the properties of the scene in fairly dramatic ways, and the second perk is that things like shadows will be fairly crisp. You don't need to worry about things like baked resolutions, and the file sizes on real-time lighting are quite a bit smaller as well. The big issue with relying on runtime lighting is that runtime lighting doesn't really look as good as baked lighting. Now, baked lighting comes in a whole bunch of flavors, and I think we're going to go through all of them sort of one by one here, and I'll sort of show off the benefits in each, and we'll actually be able to play around and show some of this stuff. One of the perks of Unity 5.6, which we've upgraded to recently, is the new progressive light mapper. The progressive light mapper, which has sort of been in public release for about 3 months now. It's still a preview release. If you go into the window, then lighting, you've got this panel here, and I'll just pull this one off. Oop. Did not plan on doing that. Sorry, guys. Thank you, Unity. There we go. This window here, which is quite a big complex one, contains everything to do with how lighting is impacted in your scene, particularly in how it relates to baked lighting. So, what is light baking? Light baking is basically the pre-computation of all the lighting solutions in the scene. So, for instance, if we have a light that I pull into the scene here, you can see it sort of begins to affect that area here. But I'll just make this one quite a bit bigger so I can actually really see the effect dramatically. Oh, a bit too dramatic. What we can see here is it's lighting things directly, but what's not happening is the light is not bouncing off things and hitting other objects. So, for instance, a super bright light source won't bounce into here and then bounce perhaps off that wall and then finally illuminate this area over here. So if we had this particular light at a really insane intensity, so this is 5 right now, let's set this up to something that's just absurd. So there we go. That's going to be obscenely bright. That is 99 times the maximum lighting value for everything that's lit there, and as you can see, it's completely blown out. But if we now make this one a baked light, and we bake the illumination, which I can show you quickly, you'll see that actually what's going to happen is that light is actually going to start progressing through the scene. It's going to bounce, and what's happening is that we've got a radiosity solution running, which basically simulates photons emitting from the lights and bounces them around the scene, lighting things as it goes. So actually this one is not... oh, here we go, it's still rendering. The progressive light mapper will take a second to render, and hopefully my nuclear light over here is going to brighten things up. Yeah, there we go. Now it's beginning to sort of bake things through, and where before in the real-time lighting solution you saw there was a sort of a hard curve. Now you're actually going to see that it's beginning to, it goes quite a bit further. It's bouncing all the way through the scene. In fact, it's lighting all the way over here. We'll give this one a second run as I discuss it. So baked lighting also provides for the ability for area emitters. That means that light surfaces that are not a single point. If you've noticed in all real-time lighting systems in Unity, that all light sources emit from a single finite infinite point. When you look at the real world, everything that emits light tends to have some surface area attached to it. If it's a light globe, it's got the filament. If it's the sun, it's a freaking huge ball of fire. Everything that's sort of in the real world that emits light emits it from an area, whereas everything in games tends to emit it from a single point. The problem with that single point is that it actually doesn't look as good. So as this bakes, the advantage of area lighting is particularly that you can create more complex, softer, smoother shadowing environments. For instance, the lights from a single infinite point are going to be very crisp on the edge. If the light is thicker and wider, then what happens is actually the light is being emitted from all points on that sphere and it'll actually diffuse, and the shadows will end up a bit softer. So as you can see here already that with the baked lighting, we're already looking a ton better than we did on the real-time lighting for this kind of scenario. And I'll let this one tick down for a little bit longer. The basics of light mapping to get into. Unity has a built-in light mapper that makes it very straightforward and simple to build your light maps. I'm just going to cancel this now. You can sort of see the impacts of how this looked at the basic solution, but as you can see, it's now bouncing off walls and bouncing back. You can sort of see some of it bounced onto the rafters there. That'll look better and better the longer I leave that to run, but for now I won't. So, light mapping basics. First is you need to have one of the two light mapping solutions on. You've got two options here. You've got real-time lighting and you've got mixed lighting. Now, mixed lighting is best used in almost all scenes. You use it when your major light sources in the scene don't move around. Now, exceptions to that are things like if you've got a day-night cycle in your scene, you don't want to use mixed lighting, because what will happen is it'll bake for the point that you've got in the editor. So say your editor is set by default to the middle of the day and you use mixed lighting. When it suddenly becomes night, it won't look right because you have the lighting solution for a day, but the actual real-time lights and things will be affected for your night and it'll look all wrong. For that, you can use real-time lighting. So the primary differences between these two solutions are real-time lighting actually pre-calculates not just one set of... So when it... I'll go back a little bit. When it builds lighting for these... When it bounces all those photons around the scene, it actually saves them into a texture map. So basically every time that light pings around the scene, you can actually see them here on the global maps. I don't know if I can actually select those because they haven't finished baking, but you can sort of see them roughly here. They're basically a whole bunch of weird coloured textures, and those basically every time it bounces a photon, it lights up the pixel that it landed on, and it basically sends thousands and thousands of these photons tracing through the scene one by one, and as it does that, it impacts on the texture. The texture a little bit brighter for every point it hits, and it keeps on going for every light source in the scene. Now, in mixed lighting, which is the one that you probably want to use, it creates one set of textures for that. So what it does is it creates just one texture that overlays over the whole level as what's called a light map, and that covers all the objects in your scene. For real-time lighting, instead of creating one texture for every, well, for all objects in the scene, it actually creates lots of them. It creates one for every light source in the scene, and that texture map may not cover everything on the object, so it won't create tons and tons of textures for objects that won't be lit by that particular light, but it will create light maps for every object that is impacted by a light. So it creates thousands of little light maps that store the data for every single light in the scene. This is storage expensive. It is very easy to get real-time lighting solutions that weigh in at hundreds of megabytes for data, but the perk of this system is that if you've got major moving light sources, like for instance a day-night light, it can actually update based on how that light moves. So you can rotate that light through the scene, you can change the colors, you can do all that stuff, and the pre-computed information that exists for real-time lighting will get reapplied in real time. So you can actually get the benefits of real-time lighting, which let you modify things in the scene at any time you want. So you've got animated lights, all those kinds of things. You get those benefits, but you also get the benefits of light being traced through your scene. And as it traces through your scene, it gets all those nice little bounces and things. So real-time lighting is one to use if you've got something that's a smaller scene, because you obviously do have to weigh against the larger file sizes it generates. And you also have to be a little bit careful about setting up your lights, maybe not making too many of them as purely baked. You can actually, if you set them static, I believe it will actually trim them back and use only a normal one set of light maps for it. But if they are not marked static, they will get built all those extra little maps and it will use up a whole bunch of space. So, those are your two major options. Now, mixed lighting is the one I'm going to probably cover a little bit more today because it's more useful. Out of 9 out of 10 scenes that we build for ourselves, we'll use mixed lighting because generally speaking, most scenes are static and you don't have too much in the way of changing light sources. Sorry, just reading the back scroll in chat. Yeah, unfortunately, I'm not streaming at the full desktop resolution, so what I'll do is I'll just talk through the options and make sure that you can understand what they are. Unfortunately, my upload speed on my interrogation is not good enough to stream my entire desktop at full resolution at a decent frame rate. Okay, so moving on, mixed lighting. Mixed lighting comes in a couple of modes. So previously, up until 5.6, Unity only had one real mode for mixed lighting and a couple of variations on it. And that was you had one set of light maps and they basically lit everything in the scene. You couldn't have runtime lighting combined with baked lighting. In the previous versions of Unity, Unity 4, we actually had the ability to have mixed lighting, and now, as of Unity 5.6, we've got it back. It is a very important thing to use because mixed lighting lets you have real-time lighting up close. So what we can do is we can actually, if we look at these, for instance, shadows in the baked lighting, it's not particularly a great example. So I'm just going to nuke my nuclear light, if I can find it. It should be down there. Yep. And I'm just going to bake the scene again, quickly. So here you can see the light maps are regenerating again for my baked scene. It's the progressive light mapper has the ability to actually focus on the area that's visible on screen. So as you see, I move around, that the area that it's focused on is getting the resolution first. So if I cancel that one, you can see here that the light maps are quite blurry. They're a little bit low resolution. Now some of that is useful. Shadows in real life do tend to blur a little bit depending on the size of the light source, which I was talking about before. But the other important factor is that these guys are kind of blurry. Now, if I compare this to the real-time lighting, you'll see that they're actually quite crisp. So the benefits of using mixed lighting is you actually get both. What it'll use is it'll use the shadows and lighting from up close. So things that are nearby will render at the resolution you want them to, but things that are far away will actually use the baked lighting. So if we move away from here, you'll actually see that the shadows on those palm trees, for example, have disappeared. When we've got baked lighting in the scene, those shadows will actually stay, and it'll switch to using the version inside the inside the light map instead of doing the full computation all the time. So actually baking light maps can be beneficial from a performance standpoint. If you've got static light sources, so you've got to tag your sunlight as static, and to do that you just find the directional light, you click it up here in the inspector, and you click static in the corner. That will make it static, and if the objects are static, then it'll actually only ever use the baked light sources, which again will cut down on the runtime requirements for your scenes quite dramatically. Shadows are a very expensive effect to produce computationally, so the more you can shift into the static and baked light maps, the better. Moving back here, so mixed lighting basically lets us use both those maps combined. Now there's a few modes here. You can use either baked indirect, in which case the shadows never get baked into the light maps. That means if you want to rely entirely on runtime shadows but want to have all the bounced reflections and lighting, use the baked indirect. It's also the smallest file size of all the options you've got available to you. Because it doesn't require generating two sets of maps, one with shadows and one without, it actually uses less file size than the other options. So it's one worth thinking about using if, again, you're not too picky about this stuff. It's probably the most common one you want to use. The next option is the default, which is the subtractive. Subtractive is basically what I was saying before, that you've got sort of two sets of light maps and it uses one for generating shadows and one that's got just the lighting information. There's two other modes, and unfortunately I don't know quite the full technical details on this. This is something that you're going to have to look at the Unity documentations, but I know the basics of is the shadow mask options. And the shadow mask options do require you not use the progressive light mapper. You have to use the old Enlighten light mapper, which is quite a bit slower than the progressive one, and I'm not such a big fan of. But the shadow mask options also let you encode specularity into your light maps. So if you've got particularly metallic scenes, I can actually show you a great example of what happens with metallics and light maps. They actually get a little bit flat. And the reason for that is because it's only storing 1 bit per pixel. It's not storing the directions of how things reflect off. So I think I've still got my reflective material from the previous session. Yes, I do. So I'm gonna have to bake a cube map in here as well, just so you can actually see this guy. And I'll just make you a bit bigger. Oops. So, this guy is my reflective material. I'm just going to make it a little bit less metallic so you can actually see it. Keep that low. If I put a point light in here, you can actually see that it's generating quite a distinct reflection off the object from the material. The material, basically, if you look at it in real time, is quite sharp. If we add bump maps and things to this, I don't know if I've got it in this scene, but I'll try and find a bump. That will do. And I'll just set this guy up so it's a little bit more detailed. You can see here that we've got sort of these nice, crisp little lighting highlights coming off it. Now, if we set this guy to baked, and I set this object to baked, and go into the lighting panel and generate, we're going to suddenly lose all of our nice little bits. So this will take a second to calculate, but suddenly you'll notice it's quite flat. In fact, I've just done something stupid. I've left that on there. So I'm just going to set this back to subtractive, because I just implemented the very solution that we're discussing. So now, here we go. It's baked the lighting, and suddenly you see we've lost all those pretty little highlights. So if you're doing things like metallic hallways, science fiction regions, that kind of thing, then suddenly you want those bright little spots to come off the edge, because it really signifies that this is shiny. And if you use the pure baked options, it doesn't. So when you're using the enlightened-based light mapper and use shadow masks, and unfortunately this will require too long to calculate for me to do this in this video tutorial. It does require a little bit of time to produce, probably about 20 or 30 minutes for this kind of sized scene. You'll actually get all those bright highlights back from how it looked in real time, but it will also use the reflected data, which gives you sort of the best of both worlds. Again, I would look up the Unity documentation on this one, because I don't know this one inside out yet, but it is worth investigating if you're doing those kinds of regions that rely on a lot of very shiny objects and lots of little reflections. So, that covers probably the very basics of what is light mapping, how you use it. It's probably also worth noting that if you've got objects like this guy, so you can see these mushrooms here, they're glowing. If you look at them in real time, so let's take this light away. This is how it looks in the scene normally. Light maps let you bake emissive surfaces. So this particular set of mushrooms is actually, it's got an emission on it, and it's got a value of 1, and it's set static. So when I bake this, have a look what happens on the background rocks here. This will actually pick up some of the emission from the mushrooms, and they will appear on the rocks. I'll just take a second. Just for reference, if you're baking stuff, you can never have too much RAM in your computer. This is one thing where Unity will happily chug up 64 gig if you've got it. So here we go. You can see actually, even now, it's quickly beginning to illuminate from those mushrooms. As you let this compute and bake more and more, the lighting will look better and better. What I'm doing here with these quick passes is really just for previewing. The final results really do look tons better. Okay, so that's the basics of light mapping, where you would use it and why. The next thing to get into is really space specific, and that is file size. Now, the big thing you guys want is you don't want to use up tons and tons and tons of megabytes storing light maps, because even in this particular scene, I've got 80 megabytes worth of light maps with the default settings. This scene is not particularly big, so I'll just clear that data again. This scene, as you can see, it's only a small section. There's some bits in the background and whatnot, but really, ultimately, this is not worthy of 80 megabytes worth of lighting data. It might be. I mean, depending on what you're doing, that may be adequate in what you're looking for, but often it's not. So the first thing you need to do is, particularly if you're not using the subtractive or the shadow mask options, if you're using just baked in direct, you can actually get away with a really low light map resolution. So in this case, right now, it's set to 50 texels per unit in the light map resolution. Now, 50 texels per unit actually means that there is 50 pixels times 50 pixels for every sort of 1 meter squared of surface area on the object. So what you can do is you can actually lower that. You can get away with quite a bit lower before it actually starts to be really noticeable. So here, I'm just going to bake here, because these rocks are a really nice little demo of how lighting should look. I'll bake here. This is at our default of 50. And then I'm going to subtractively lower it. For a scene this size, I would consider even going down to about 7. 7 is probably fine. So we'll just wait for this to bake, and then I will change the values, and we can have a look at how that looks on 7. Again, you might want to sort of tweak and adjust here. This is obviously still baking, and the resolution will get a little bit better as it finishes up the baking process. So what we're comparing here is not entirely fair, because it is reasonable to expect to run the full light mapper before making complete evaluation judgments. But just off the quick basis here, I mean, this is probably good enough to get a rough idea. So this is set at 50. I'm going to lower this down to 7. Now, hopefully you guys can sort of remember the rough layout of how this looks. I mean, it's decent. This is going to be at 7. And as it changes, we'll probably just wipe everything out. You can see it's gone down a bit, particularly around where my cursor is around here. You can see there's a couple of rough edges. I think they'll smooth out as the bake progresses, but the light map resolution has been reduced. Now, the difference in file size between 7 and 50 is quite dramatic. I'm just going to quickly clear this data. Here we go. So the difference between that was, this is now only 16 megabytes of light map data instead of 80 megabytes, which is obviously a big reduction. The quality reduction is not that dramatic, as you can see, so you can actually get away with it. Now, if we I'll just keep baking over here, you can see if this is actually any better or worse, but this is something you will want to fiddle with. What we have done, though, is part of the space editor pack, the most recent ones we've been handing out, has been our new lighting tool. And our new lighting tool is actually designed to give you some sensible default values for the light map resolution. So you go space, lighting, and then go smart lighting presets. This is in the menu. So again, space, lighting, then smart lighting presets. The first tab on this window actually gives you control over baked lighting, and you can pick a couple of options. It'll let you pick whether optimized for static lighting or runtime lighting. This goes back to that enlightened versus progressive thing that we discussed at the very beginning, where we're talking about whether there's 50,000 little light maps or one big one. So if you've got mostly static objects in the scene, leave this one ticked, because it'll give you much better options. The next one we got is to create a probe rig, and I'll get onto probes in a second before we move on to post, because probes are another way that we can actually cut lighting sizes even in a more dramatic way. The next thing we've got is you can pick whether it's an indoors or an outdoors scene, and you can pick sort of the rough size of your object. So whether you want to use no baking for your objects, or whether you want to use, for instance, if the scene is room-sized, building-sized, block-sized, small city-sized, and large city-sized. And depending on the values of those two ones, it'll try and pick some sensible defaults for light map resolutions that make sense for your scene, that won't use up tons and tons of megabytes of storage. So that one's probably a useful little one here. The other thing worth poking at is that this editor pack, in fact 10.7 has got some more presets attached to it finally, but this one also has a presets button that lets you preset general lighting in your scene. So you can actually adjust, for instance, the details on the sun color and everything like that. So if we actually go in here, we can go to, say I want the sun to be pink. You click pink here, give it a second to run. Now it's picked a, maybe not pink enough. Oh, that was the sky color I adjusted, not the sun. We flip that around. So the sky color to that. There we go. So now you can actually get some quick presets for reasonable looking light. So it actually counts things like reflected bounce lighting. When you've got an avatar in your scene, it's actually quite important, as if you remember from last week, to make sure that you've got sort of nice, even, smooth light. Now, light maps actually do help with that quite considerably, because they can actually, the bounce lighting can bounce off the ground and back onto the avatar, so you don't get those harsh shadows that we've been talking about last week. And I will put last week's video up. I do promise I'll get it up. It's just been sort of one thing after the other this week. So this smart lighting presets tool that we've got actually sort of calculates some reflex lights as well. So actually what it does is, where we've got the directional lights, which it puts into one little thing here. If we go find this guy, you can see that there's a directional light there that's sort of pointing that way. We also place a bounce light that looks like that, and actually that bounce light counts for effectively bounce lighting off the ground, and it's sort of semi-inverted, but will give you a way of actually keeping the other objects in the scene lit. We also modify some things like the gradient colors and whatnot in the scene, but for now I'm just going to go back to something-ish normal. Maybe it's not quite normal, is it? There we go. So I'm just going to flip back to there. I'm just going to kill my baked data. Okay, so one last thing before we go to probes, and that is shadow resolution. So, sorry, not shadow resolution, the shadow angles. So on point lights, if we create a point light, as I was discussing that things that are small, so most light sources in the real world aren't infinite points, in baked lighting we can actually do that as well. So what you can do is when you've got under the inspector, when you've got a point light selected, is you can actually set, when it's set to baked, there is a new, wait, where is it? There, should be there. Oh, when shadows are enabled. When it's baked and shadows are enabled, you've got this baked shadow radius, and that actually says the width of the light. So if I set that to, let's, in fact, what I'll do is I'll just set up a small box here so we can actually see the impact, and I'm just going to set the light map resolution back up a bit so we can guarantee to see the effects. So you are going to be quite bright, and hopefully I'm seeing you cast a shadow off here. Okay. So I've got a shadow on this box here. Now when I bake this, and I'm just going to set the lighting resolutions back to 50. Just give it a second to calculate. And of course, one thing to remember is that everything needs to be marked static if you want to bake it. This is something that I just got tripped up by. That'll tell it to actually include it in the lighting solution. So now, when I calculate it, hopefully I'll get some actual baked lighting coming out of that. Here we go. So, this light here has a shadow radius of 0.5, and that means that it's basically treated as if the light source is 1 meter in width. So it's a half meter radius there. So half a meter radius is about the size of that cube, actually. So the light source is a theoretical sphere about that big. And you can see the shadows are quite diffuse here. They're not very sharp. And the reason for that is that the light source is emitting lights from the edges as well as every point on the surface. So some are coming from the top and bouncing over the top. Some are coming from here. The bulk of it will be behind that object, so it gets darker. But because it's not coming from a single point, the edges on the shadow aren't particularly sharp. If I go ahead and set this to a really low value, like 0, and that'll bring back to the same as real time, and bake again, we'll be able to see that the shadows are now going to be quite a bit harsher on the edges. So I'll just take a second to... Still taking a moment. You can already see that it's getting quite a bit harsher as it calculates. Now it's still not going to be completely smooth because under baked lighting it's going to account for the fact that the object is bouncing light around the place, so the light that goes there is going to bounce off there, bounce there, back, and so forth. But as this calculates more and more, the lower the shadow value, the sharper those edges of the shadow come from. The second one is for directional lights. The same thing applies. If I go to the light source for the scene, so where's my directional light now? It's down here. Go to the sunlight and set it to baked. So now this guy, it's again, that should be quite a sharp lighting on this guy. So again, it'll take a second to calculate, and this is this is probably not the greatest thing to video because it does take some time and experimentation to get these things right. But you can see that again, it's a little bit sharp there. It's still baking around the place, and as it goes, it'll get sharper and sharper still. But what you can do with directional lights is set the angle. So this is different to the size. This actually sets the sort of the angles at which light rays can hit the ground. So they're not coming down completely parallel. By default, they are completely parallel. But you can actually make them sort of a heterogeneous mix, and if you do that, you get nice soft overcast shadows. So I'm going to set this up to a really high value. I'm going to set this up to 50 degrees, so it means it's going to go to a sort of a range between 0 and 50 degrees of random lights entering the scene. And as we do that, what we're going to see is we're going to get a more overcast effect. So immediately you can notice when I'm baking this that the shadows are almost not there anymore, and that's because it's coming down from all angles and it's giving you sort of a very overcast, nice effect. Now that's something you probably do want to consider in outdoor scenes, is having a bit more of an overcast light. That's in the lighting, it's just the baked shadow angle. It's in the same spot as the radius if you're using the point light. It'll only appear if the object is, if the mode is set to mixed or baked though, just to be aware. It won't appear in any other cases, and it's got to be a shadow caster as well. Okay, so that covers the basics of that guy. Now, light probes. We discussed this very briefly last week, and that is that we had the ability to have light probes appear, these sort of sample baked lighting in the 3D space. So instead of the baked lighting just being purely on the surfaces themselves, these guys basically act as little mini cameras that sample the lighting at any point in the scene. And when you select one, you can sort of see how it's baked. So this guy, I'm just going to quickly bake something very, very, very quickly. Hopefully it'll actually generate. I'm not sure you actually can get the baked lighting results without doing a full completed bake, but let's see if I can. No, I can't. But these, when you've got these little spheres selected, they'll actually show what they're sampling. So these are good because they sample real-time things, so avatars running through the scene, that kind of thing, and it lets them pick up the ambient environmental bounce lighting, area lights, that kind of thing coming from the baked lighting system into your real-time solution. But they can also be used to cheat on storage space for your lighting. So as I said before, the biggest thing you've got control over is the light map resolution. The higher the light map resolution, the higher the storage requirements. Light probes, on the other hand, are pretty much constant to the number of light probes you've got in the scene, and this is something that lets you actually sneak around light mapping a little bit. I'm doing some experiments here on the side to see if we can actually use a light probe system for baking into vertex colors, because then theoretically we could actually cut the requirements for storage on light mapping quite considerably. So if you're focused on getting scenes that load quickly and have no problem sort of storing themselves despite the large quantities of content, so to say, for example, you're doing a large exterior scene or something that needs a lot of space, light probe grids may be the solution for doing this. So come back to me at some point, maybe in the next couple of weeks, and I'll be happy to report back on how that's going. But in the meantime, what you can do is you can actually also use something called a light probe volume. So instead of having this completely baked and we have the surface area, what we can do is we can actually sample a rough version instead. And I'm just going to clear this data. And for some reason, I've lost the ability to select objects. Oh, there we go. Okay. So when we've got a thing here, normally what would happen is we'd get unwrapped on the light map unwrapper, and we'd be sampling those points and go into the light map data. What we can do instead is we can actually set this one to be not light mapped. That's the first thing we need to do. So we need to find the mesh renderer, and you can actually just hit scale in light map, and you currently see it's at 0.008. And this one, what we can do is we can set that to 0. Now when 0 happens, it means that the light map will be aware of its existence. If it's a emissive light source, it will emit light, but the difference is it won't receive light. Now this is important because what we can do is we can actually substitute how it receives light with something called a light probe proxy volume. Now these guys are a little bit expensive if they're moving around, so just be aware that don't put them on too many moving objects if they've got lots and lots of points, because they require generating a cube map, and there's a bit of a mess here. If you can share a light probe proxy volume between multiple objects, that's also worth doing. The new welcomes area, I'm actually using them for the thatch roofs, and that's because we can get a much more nice, smooth gradient that accounts for the fact that light's transmitting through the thatch a little bit as well here. But that's a more complex topic for another day. So what we can do is, the first thing we do is we create an empty object, and we attach a light probe proxy volume. Light probe proxy volume. What you see here is basically a little box, and this is going to sample light from the points and actually build a cube map from this, and this can be actually used by your objects. So the bounding box mode normally will size to the scale of the object if this is attached to an object with a mesh renderer. So if I go out of this guy and I'll just add one to here. I'll set to use proxy volume. Where are we? Sorry, one sec. Proxy volume, there we go. So now you can see we've got the proxy volume cube over there, and this one we can actually set the resolution mode. So the higher the density, the more corners and things we get onto it. So I'll set this to custom, and I'll say there's going to be 8 points. I'm not quite sure why I'm not seeing the array of points. I think it may only show in a scene that's actually got fully baked lighting. But what this does is this bounding box, it'll sample light from each of the corners and then use that as its reflected solution. So it's only an approximation. It's not the full baked lighting requirements. But the benefit of it is that it only needs to use the light probe grid you've set up, and the light probe grid can be substantially smaller. Each light probe contains 27 times 4 bytes. So it's about 100 and something bytes, 130 or so bytes of data per light probe you've got in there. But if you compare that, that's only the equivalent of a couple of pixels. That's 4 pixels-ish worth of data. So if you've got a light map, suddenly those light maps, which have got sort of megapixels worth of data, you can have a lot of light probes instead. So what you can do is you can mix and match using the light probes as the way of sampling your lighting data, but use a very large light probe proxy grid for your for baking the data, and that way you can actually, the combination of setting the light map size on the original object to 0, plus adding a light probe proxy volume, plus adding light probes through the scene, can give you baked data that one works with avatars and things as they move through the scene, because you've got all those nice light probes through the place. But it also gives you the benefit of low file size. So the total file size for a massive grid of light probes is still only going to be a couple of kilobytes, whereas for a very large array of light maps, you can multiple megabytes. It is actually an effective way of doing it. Now, the only thing to be aware of is that these light probe proxy volumes do require quite a bit of heavy calculation every single frame that they move. And it's also best to share them between multiple objects. You can actually create one proxy volume that covers a sort of a wider area. And the benefit of doing that, particularly if you've got lots of small little tiny objects in the inside, is that it shares the 3D texture that it generates, because that can actually occupy quite a bit of video memory on the client if you're not careful about it. So that's something, just a little trick to discuss. Now, I'm going to move on to, and I'm going to cut into my office hours. So I apologize to everyone who's showing up for my office hours, because I do want to give the post stack a little bit of a rundown as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to reload this scene without my modifications to the lighting system. So this is actually quite a nice scene, but it's not quite AAA yet. That is to say that it doesn't quite look like a full gaming environment. It's pretty, and it's very well set up, and it's a great little one, which is why I'm using it as a showcase. But there is more we can do with it, especially with space. So the first thing we do is we grab the camera. Now, if you're using our player char or whatever, then that's fine. It's got one already. You can actually use the post-processing behavior to slot in a post profile. So to do that, you just right-click in your scene somewhere, in your project somewhere, and you can go create. And you can create a post-processing profile. So I'll just create this one for Savannah, and I'll slot this into my camera. And now when we do this, we'll actually be able to modify and see the changes in real time. So if you don't see the changes in real time, on the toolbar at the top below your sort of scene tab, there's a bunch of icons. There's one that looks like a little picture and then a down arrow next to it. Just click to the down arrow and click image effects, and that will apply these things in real time, so you actually preview as you go. So this lets you control almost everything relating to the scene. So you can control the bloom. So let's say I want to make this kind of soft and nice. This kind of feels like a Final Fantasy game now, because they like to use lots of soft little bloom. The post-processing stack is incredibly powerful. You can do so much with it. It's I'm not kidding. We've added a couple of extensions onto it. We've added a sharpening filter. We've added a volumetric lighting filter. We've added a couple of other ones. They unfortunately only show in the viewer, but the top ones, all but those last two, will show in real time as we modify the scene. So, for instance, we can add some ambient occlusion here. The ones to avoid from a performance perspective, and I'll just cover this off quickly. If you're worried about frame rate in your scenes, avoid ambient occlusion, or at least set the sample count down. The default medium can be quite heavy. Setting it down to lowest doesn't actually impact the visual quality that much comparatively. I mean, ultimately, some people will prefer to have the sample count at something obscene, but if you're worried about frame rate or you're getting frame rate problems, ambient occlusion is one to go with, to switch off. Depth of field is very pretty, but that's also one that can occupy quite a lot of runtime. Screen space reflections is probably the most expensive effect that you can run. We'd run it by default, and it's not terribly bad, but again, if you're worried about frame rates, real-time reflections is one to leave off. And finally, motion blur. Motion blur is okay on modern hardware, but it has a disproportionate effect on older hardware. Older hardware, it sort of really begins to chug. So most of these guys are pretty straightforward. I'm not going to go into them in much detail. So for instance, bloom lets you control the glow of effects. What you can do is you can set first the threshold, and that's how bright something needs to get before it glows. The default of 1.1 is sensible. That is to say, an object needs to get brighter than pure white in order to bloom. To do that, you just need to have something with an intensity more than 1 closing off it. So you can see here we're actually blooming now, because this has got some insane intensity values attached to it. But the other values on the bloom are pretty straightforward. I mean, you can control quite a few things. You can set the radius, the knee, which sort of impacts how smooth and things it is. So if I set this one down, you can sort of play with this one. You can see how smooth the transition is between the lighting and the knot. You can also attach lens dirt, which is often a nice little effect to add. It's not terribly hard, and we actually ship with a couple of ones that are supplied through the Unity post stack, what this is built on. The big one, though, that I think is worth coming into is color grading. Now, there's a whole bunch of other effects here which I can let you fiddle around with, but color grading has a bunch of little secret settings in it that are worth discussing. So color grading is traditionally used in film. It lets you basically recolor the scene to make it more interesting. So if I pull up some reference images, say of a desert scene, I'm just going to do this on a different machine. So I apologize you won't be able to see it straight away, but I'll try and find something that looks interesting. What I can do is I can actually modify to get a similar look. In fact, what I'll do is I will grab this on here. Grab from images. I'm just going to grab something that looks interesting. So I might grab something like this. I'm just going to have this open in the background and try and color grade to look for it. So it's got lots of blues and reds. We can actually pull it up in the monitor view and try and do it that way. If you've got some access to some more sophisticated software for color grading from film studios, you can play around with it. But what we can do is first, it's fairly soft, so I'm not going to play with the tone mapper too much. You can actually flip between a bunch of settings that sort of give you sort of filmic looks and not. But by default, I mean, this one's looking pretty close already, particularly from there. So what I can do is I can actually sort of poke around with here with these guys and so we're getting a bit closer. And what I might do is I might go into the curves, and I might go into the illumination versus which one is hue versus saturation. I'm going to pull up the blues and the you can right click here and add keys, and what this does is actually lets you do this. Now I'm sure that you're all going wow at this point because this is quite a cool little tool. So maybe I've gone a little bit too. How close are we getting? Now the oranges here are quite a bit brighter, so I'm just going to add a couple of keys here. So keep you down there, but I'm just going to spike that up. So now look how close we're getting. We're getting pretty close, and I think maybe the purples are a little bit higher in here. So I might just pull another one up here. I'm just going to drag. So now you can see that we've actually produced a effect that looks quite like that image we were looking for. This tool is incredibly powerful, and this is not something you immediately know is actually in this tool. But if you are doing anything to do with lighting, you owe it to yourself to play around with the post stack, because you can now drag this into the scene, and everything in the scene will update to look at characters, vehicles, whatever gets spawned into the scene will produce this sort of color ranging effect. And it doesn't take long at all. I mean, you literally just saw me do this in a couple of minutes. So to bring this into your scene, just make sure you create an empty object and you can attach a post zone to it. So you just search for the components post zone. This will let you do it by post. You can just drag this profile we made into the profile. Ignore all the lower options. They're from a previous version. We are depreciating those ones. But yep, there we go. Post zone. So now when I upload it, it'll look like this. In fact, I will upload this scene afterwards just so you guys can go have a look. And it's pretty straightforward, and there is a lot of power here. Final notes on post, just because I do want to cover them. Grain is worth switching on. If you look at a real photo, there's tiny imperceptible amounts of grain in there, and that actually helps break up the objects a little bit, and it also counts for anti-aliasing a little bit, because if your eyes can't focus on the aliasing, you can't see it. Well, you can see it, but it's much harder to see. So setting a little bit of grain in here is actually worth doing, and you can just control with inside the post stack how much grain appears, but a little bit of grain is worth it, and it really sort of adds to the overall sharpness of the scene. If you've got grain enabled, you don't need to enable dithering either. Dithering sort of smooths out color banding, but when you've got grain, you can't see color banding. It's pretty hard to do, because again, the grain sort of breaks it up a little bit. So overall, that scene now looks quite a bit better. We might add a vignette to it just to finish it off. I might do a little bit of a bluey to match in with the reference image, but that's not so good actually. I might leave the vignette off. Switch on some chromatic aberration, so the camera's a little bit out of focus on the edges. But overall, now you've got something that looks like the reference image to a degree. You could brighten it up a little bit. I think the scene might need a little bit of lightning as well, just to pull it up a bit. But yeah, there we go. Oh, wow, there we go. That looks better. So there we go. That's how to use the post stack, at least the basics of it. I think we can go into it a bit more detail in another tutorial in the future. And we've covered off baked lighting. And hopefully those were useful to you in your building your scenes. And I look forward to see what you guys build. Cool. All right. Well, I'm going to start my office hours now. So if you are in world, I will be there in a second.